Well, good morning. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you so much for inviting me and having me. Really excited to meet and talk with you for a little while this morning. Certainly, let's be informal and ask questions, but I know we have only about 30 minutes or so as well. I'm always happy to have discussions afterwards, so please reach out. But yeah, I'm excited. Work with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, been there for about 3 years. Prior to that, I worked for Adult and Child Mental Health Center in Indianapolis for 27 years, where I was involved in clinical services and support services for people experiencing homelessness and mental health and substance use, and managed a lot of housing programs and homeless programs. So come to you with a lot of on-the-ground experience, and love talking about how do we end homelessness in our communities. So today we're going to talk a little bit about housing first. Is that a familiar term to most folks? Or great. So this, for some it'll be a review, some we'll dive in a little bit, but just kind of center the conversation. So a little bit about CSH. We're a national organization, and so we're really focused on advancing housing solutions, focusing on building strong communities, maximizing public resources, and improving the lives of vulnerable individuals. And these are kind of our lines of business, if you will. So we do the training and the education, consulting assistance. We have a lending arm. We do a lot of policy and advocacy at all different levels. So we're out there trying to end homelessness on all different levels. So housing first and permanent supportive housing, or PSH, lots of parallels there. And so just a couple of slides that ground us on what is permanent supportive housing and then how that kind of relates to housing first, right? So we use a housing first model, evidence-based practice to deliver that high quality permanent supportive housing, right? So we want that decent, safe, affordable, community-based housing for individuals. We want them to have that right of tenancy and flexible and voluntary services. So there's sort of this four-legged stool, if you will, around supportive housing. We know we need the housing piece, right? So we need those units, we need those properties and projects, we need the rental assistance. We also know we need high-quality property management and landlords to work with us. We need those service providers that are on site and in our communities that link and coordinate with those property managers to be able to provide those services and manage those units. And then we want to have a high-quality relationship with the community and help communities see that permanent supportive housing and housing first is the answer to help our homeless neighbors, and that it does work. We can have single site, we can have scattered site, right? So single site is where we might build that property, provide supportive housing. It could be 100% supportive housing. It might have a percentage that's supportive housing. The rest might be affordable housing or even market rate. And then that scattered site model where those units are scattered around our communities. These are the key components. We're going to talk a lot about how these parallel with housing first. So I'm not going to go through each one of these here, but just want you to see that there are these, 6 key components, and you'll see that, again, they match up very well with housing first. But again, it's that looking at identifying people with multiple barriers, the persons experiencing homelessness in most cases, providing that lease, the affordability component, having those flexible voluntary services that meet the needs of the individuals that we're working with, coordination among all our partners, and that connection to community. How do we help people then become housed, access the services and supports they need, and become thriving members of their community? So housing first. What is housing first? So we've kind of already talked a little bit about it from the standpoint of permanent supportive housing, but Housing First is an evidence-based practice, so it's recognized at the national level by SAMHSA, by HUD, by the National Alliance to End Homelessness. So all of those kind of national and funding level arms identify Housing First as the way we best serve our homeless neighbors, and identifying that HUD expects Housing First to be the method we use. So any of you who are involved in HUD funding, the NOFO, we have 2 days before the NOFO is due, that there's a whole component of Housing First. So it is not only a effective model, but an expected model, if you will. 2 central premises. So quickly rehousing individuals, helping people exit homelessness quickly and not return to homelessness, not having those multiple episodes. So systems coming together and identifying how do we quickly move people. We identify them in our homeless system, maybe through coordinated entry is the most common way, and they quickly access and move into permanent housing. And then we're working with them, again, wrapping those services so that there aren't those additional episodes of homelessness. And then, again, making sure that we have voluntary services, intensive services that we wrap, meeting the needs of the individuals and households that we're serving, and that those services are housing focused, right? So tenancy-based services, that what is it going to take for each individual household to remain housed? And that may look different. And so our services really have to meet those needs of all our different tenants and the different levels of intensity that they have. Housing First really looks at taking out the housing ready idea. We don't even use the term housing ready when we talk about Housing First, because if someone is experiencing homelessness, they need housed, and it's not about whether they're ready to be housed or not. Everybody deserves and is ready to be housed, right? We know that people have multiple barriers that make it difficult to access and maintain that housing, but it's not a question of housing ready. Who determines housing ready, right? And we've done this for years, and we still do this in some places and entities where, we identify through assessments or through steps and things, expectations that people have to meet in order to be housing ready. But what we know is that with housing, people then are in a better position to be able to benefit from services or interventions and the things that they are needing. We know that it's really, really hard to even meet basic needs. It's really, really hard to get into treatment if you're living in a shelter or living unhoused. So just the idea of having that basic housing need or having that basic housing need fulfilled allows then for services to be more effective and accessible. So we're not looking for people to be sober to enter supportive housing. We're not looking for people, are you taking your medications? Are you making your appointments? Do you have good credit history? Have you had evictions? All of these things. We know a lot of people we're working with, they have, issues with this in the past. They may have those evictions. They may have current and ongoing substance use issues and needs. Again, addressing those things is much more successful and effective when people are housed. This is sort of another version of that, is this traditional approach versus a Housing First approach. We step away from that stair-step expectation, and that knowing that shelters are an extremely important component of our homeless service continuum, and that transitional housing is an important component too, especially when it comes to some of our sober living and addiction services. But the ultimate goal is permanent housing. And so if people don't have to make those steps, that's great, right? And so our goal would be to put ourselves out of business from the standpoint of not having shelters or being able to help people fully access supportive housing right from being unsheltered or right from shelters. So again, we're not looking at treatment compliance. We're not looking at sobriety or abstinence in order for people to move to supportive housing. It's straight from homelessness to supportive housing with those flexible services. So what are those benefits of supportive housing? From your guys' perspective, what are some of the benefits that you've seen or understand? Great. Yeah, did y'all hear her? So being able to not only obtain that housing, but maintain that stable housing through services.
Lower interactions with law enforcement?
Yes, huge benefit, lower interactions with law enforcement.
Greater attendance of food for kids?
Perfect, yes. So for families that are in supportive housing, and using Housing First, we see greater school attendance and outcomes. Mm-hmm. Super. Yeah, exactly what we're talking about here. And it's beyond just the housing, which is what we're saying, right? This is housing first, it's not housing only. And I think that's a really important thing. There are plenty of people out there, now more than ever, nationally, that are trying to say housing first doesn't work and are promoting more shelter and those sorts of things. And what we need to be able to say is that we're not talking about housing only. We're talking about helping people get housed and then having access to those services. High fidelity housing first only works if we have those services connected. And so that's a really, really key component. And where we see some of those outcomes waver around housing stability, we can usually tie it back to not having the robust services attached in the way that are needed. Great. So these are our key principles of Housing First, and you'll see that parallel with one of those first slides that I shared that described what is permanent supportive housing. So direct, quick access to housing, talked about that. How do we get people into housing quickly? Without a lot of barriers. And we'll go through each of these a little bit more. That robust service, and it's voluntary in nature. Services are voluntary for the tenants and the folks that we're serving. They're not voluntary for us as service providers. I think that's really key. Yes, people may turn us down and say they're not interested, and that gives us more opportunity to think about what is it for that person that that they need or they want. How can I connect with them? So that assertive engagement is really, really important on our end. We don't give up, and we continue to work with people. What are those basic needs they may have? How can we make that connection? We're looking at targeting the most vulnerable individuals. So in most cases, it's individuals from our coordinated entry, our regional coordinated entry lists. So those individuals have higher vulnerability. They're prioritized based on the different vulnerabilities and needs that they have. And so we know that that's what Housing First was created for. Originally it was created, gosh, I don't know, going on 25 or 30 years ago now, in New York City around people experiencing chronic homelessness. And now it's been adapted for many different populations, but it still looks at serving those individuals, again, with that highest vulnerability. Not everybody needs really intensive services. Some people need rapid rehousing and some rental assistance and a few months of services, and they can do well and move on. So individuals with Housing First approach and supportive housing need those longer-term connections to services. We embrace harm reduction, so not looking at abstinence being a goal, but instead helping people look at risky behaviors and how to reduce those behaviors so that they are able to better thrive and maintain housing. And then we provide individuals with leases. So this isn't a month-to-month. It isn't a, hey, if you do okay and you follow the rules, you get to stay. This is a lease like any of the rest of us would have with the protections as a leaser, and also the responsibilities. So it's important that folks understand what those responsibilities of a lease are. And as a service provider, that's one of the things we're doing, is honing in on, hey, this is what's in your lease. It might be 25 pages long. Let's hone in on what it really says here. That's gonna make sure that, these could be lease violations. What are the areas you might struggle with? And let's focus in on those. And our services really hone in on avoiding lease violations and therefore avoiding that chance for eviction. And then focusing on consumer choice. So how do we really look at being person-centered and identify what is it for that particular household they want and need? Choice when it comes to what part of town do I want to live in? What does my unit look like? What floor is it on? Can I decorate the way I want? As well as choice in services. How much service, what kind of service? Those sorts of things. So some of these are repetitive, but I want to point out that some of the other key strategies is really having a simple application process so that we don't have these hoops that folks need to jump through. So what do we really need in order to get somebody moved in? What documents do we really need? How long does the process take? But we want to have simple screening that screens people in rather than out. We'll talk a little more about that. We talked about permanency. So this isn't temporary housing. This is permanent housing's here for as long as you may need it. For some people, they may never leave supportive housing. For some people, they may be in for many years. Others, they may move on after a couple of years, depending on what their needs are. Rehousing to avoid eviction is to be anticipated. And I think that's a really important point. It feels kind of negative, but if we go into it understanding that for some people, the first time isn't going to be the best fit. The second time may not be the best fit. Maybe this part of town didn't work out, or this particular unit, or the folks that were around them. Maybe some really bad things have happened to that person, and they just have had a relapse or symptom-wise. I mean, there could be so many different things that may happen that maybe rehousing them is a really good step towards their ongoing recovery. And we work to do that before an eviction happens if we can. So we work with each other to figure out, hey, Leah's really struggling here. She's had some lease violations. Maybe it'd be better if she could transfer over here. And is that possible? No, there's lots of rules and regs and all of that happen depending on the grants that folks are connected to. But I think if we have that mindset, that's okay. And it doesn't mean it's an all-out failure for our programs or for the resident or the tenant. In fact, it's one step in movement in life and moving forward. We talked about housing not contingent on compliance with services, so that voluntary nature, and that we want to have a low client to staff ratio from a service perspective. So if we don't want case managers to have caseloads of 30 and 40 people. It's really hard to manage all the basic needs and all the connections and linkages and the day-to-day services. So we're really looking more at caseloads at 15 to 20 to most effectively work with this population. So a little bit more about eliminating housing barriers. And these are just some of the questions that we may ask. You may ask yourself, you may ask your partners out there that are at that point of the application process or as people are getting ready to move into housing, right? So maybe their name comes up on the coordinated entry list. And so there's a unit available at ABC Apartments. What does that application process look like? Why do we reject applicants? And then that's that middle item there. Are your entrance criteria as low barrier as possible? So I mentioned a few minutes ago that We don't want to screen people out. We want to screen people in. So if we're in the business of housing first and supportive housing, we all need to be of the mindset that we are going to house people who have evictions and have poor credit and have criminal injustice involvement and maybe a litany of other things. That's going to be the case. We want to mitigate that. We want to work with people. We want to remove those barriers. We want to say, we recognize that, but how do we help you now? Now, we know there are some exceptions and different things. We all need to be safe in our jobs and in our communities. But there are plenty of housing providers out there that are screening everybody out. So we're looking to screen people in. So I always think that's really important, talking to property managers and service providers, that not all property managers want or need to be in housing first or supportive housing, and that's okay. But those who are, really, we need them to be operating from a low barrier perspective. Are we serving those who are homeless today? So again, if we're using coordinated entry correctly, we're identifying those individuals who are the most vulnerable. But how long does that take? So if somebody's identified today that on coordinated entry that there's a unit available or there's a spot open in a project, how long does it take to actually get that lease signed and move in? So the standards out there are 30 days or less. That's the gold standard. We don't see that too often. If your community or your projects are doing that, congratulations and spread the word on how you're doing that. But we know we have a lot of barriers out there, some of that being units available, right, in those scattered site landlords out there that are willing to lease to our folks and be involved in our projects. But sometimes it's our own communities where we're putting those barriers of moving people through these processes. So just thinking about that, and then as a community, what can we do to really decrease that amount of time it takes for someone to get housed? And then lastly, do our applicants, our tenants, our clients, do they really understand the whole process? Do they understand enough about supportive housing? How will that help them? And really getting that education. Doesn't mean that they're going to jump right into services, right? Oh, I'm housed, now I can't wait to have a case manager and have you come do home visits and do all of these things, right? No, it's not necessarily like that. But the more education we can provide them as to what services are available, how we can help and continue, to build that relationship is really key. Engaging the most vulnerable households. So this is kind of that list of folks who in supportive housing and housing first, some of their barriers and vulnerabilities that they come to us with. Usually that chronic homelessness is at the top of the list. If we end chronic homelessness, we'll still have literal homelessness, but we'll still have folks who are also experiencing these comorbidities. So just a little bit more about why are those services so important, right? We want to make a difference in helping those who are most vulnerable in our communities. And so we know that in order to sustain that housing, they often need that intensive level of service to help make those connections and, again, really honing in on managing and avoiding those lease violations. And so people often need a lot of different things, but if we can hone in, again, making that connection for people. Hey, these are the things that could get you in trouble, right? So having those guests stay too late and playing your music really loud and your neighbors complain. Okay, being a nuisance, if you will, out in the public areas. So do those things in your apartment. Keep your private life private. That's okay. What you do in your unit is your business. All those different things that can be those lease violations. How do we help folks navigate that and manage either not having the lease violations or working with property management and landlords to manage those? Hey, now that we know this is happening, we can help you out. We can work on how do we get that trash out so it doesn't get piled up and kind of start to cause an odor or cause bugs, those sorts of things, mitigating that stuff. So again, services or housing is our starting point, but then those services are what help people move towards recovery, thriving in their own self-sufficiency. So these are some of the supportive services that hopefully are being provided. Some of these are provided on site or through home visits and coming to see people in their units. Others may be referrals to some of your agencies, our connections and linkages. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it certainly helps us kind of see the breadth and depth of services that folks may need and want to access. I'll say a quick thing about peer support services. People with lived experience of homelessness, mental health, substance use, we really, really see huge benefits to bringing people with lived experience on as service providers. We don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but it's a big plug. It's something that I work on a lot. There's certification in the state of Indiana, and looking more at really amplifying the voices of people with lived experience and the value they can bring to a services team. When someone who has had similar experiences to you, looks like you, comes from the same background as you maybe, who comes in and is working alongside you, can say, I've really been there, how can I help? Really helps with engagement, both initial and ongoing engagement. So as you look at developing services in your community, look to how peer support can be an additional component to that. So a little bit about harm reduction. We could do 2 days of training on that, but this just gives you a little bit of background, depending again on your role here today. This may be more familiar, but we look at harm reduction as a set of practical strategies and interventions to work with people around managing those consequences of addiction or risk behaviors. It can really be any risk behavior that is causing them harm. Our goal is not necessarily abstinence. For some, it might be their end goal, but we're really looking at what are those safer techniques, managing use, and again, it could be abstinence. And so, again, that can tie back to lease violations. Someone who might be intoxicated and is coming out of their unit and causing issues. How do we not necessarily talk about you need to stop using or you're going to get kicked out or evicted, but instead, how do we help so that you're no longer bothering your neighbors? That's the lease violation, not using the substance. So then it's really working together on, okay, are you only going to use in your unit? Or are you not going to come out after you've used? Or are you going to use somewhere else off the property? Or it could be lots of different things. But working and negotiating with that person around managing the risk. And then again, here are just some different principles. No predefined outcomes, dignity and respect. We expect people to take responsibility for their own actions. This isn't rescuing or, approving different behavior or use, but instead helping people, again, reduce that harm. Providing tenants with a lease, we talked about this, but really understanding their rights and their responsibilities. And I think that can be really empowering. A lease is scary if you've never had one before, or if you've been evicted multiple times and not had the supports. So really understanding what does a lease mean, and that you do have those rights. And then lastly, being consumer-centered. That in everything we do, again, from the choice we're able to provide in housing, it might be choice in unit, but maybe there's only one unit available. And so there isn't choice there, but is there choice in how people can decorate their unit? Or maybe they really prefer the first floor. They don't have a diagnosed disability, but maybe they really, have some pain in their knee. Maybe at some point, if a bottom floor opens up, they could move to that unit. So just, thinking about that. And then again, I mentioned choice in services. What kind of services are they interested in? Having that variety that meets all the different needs. And again, these are some of the things that we hear people come to us with. Well, I'm not moving into an apartment if my dog can't come with me. We know that's why a lot of people stay unsheltered too. Or I really want my girlfriend or my adult daughter to be able to come with me. Is that possible? I need someplace close to the grocery store or on the bus line, right? And does housing first work? Yes, we know that it works. We've been talking about this this morning, about the different reasons why it works, what the benefits are. But just know that there's a lot of research out there over many, many years that show us that housing first does indeed work, and that these are the outcomes that we see. And they're tied basically to improving lives, right? We can put numbers to these things. We can say, nationally, 75 to 85% of people who receive housing first stay stably housed over 24 months. That's a true statement. It's measurable. But what that really means is they're staying housed, but they're able then to have those social and community connections, become part of their communities. It means they're able to increase or maintain their income. Maybe now they're able to access Social Security or disability benefits, or they're able to get back to work if that's something that they're interested in. You mentioned improved attendance at school for kiddos. Satisfaction, feeling good about where they live and the services that they're receiving. And that improved health. And I think, we haven't talked about that much today, but how important that is. When you're living unsheltered, how do you take care of your physical and your mental health, right? And so having a place to live allows you to be in a place where, hey, now I have a place to store my medications. I have a place where, I can take my diabetes, my blood sugar, and those sorts of things. I can eat a little healthier. And I have peace of mind. My anxiety isn't as high when I'm having to worry about being safe. I can better manage my symptoms and my needs. So again, all of that, we can tie numbers to all this, but really looking at improving lives. And then we also know, and some of you mentioned things related to this, that supportive housing decreases costs in our systems. So we know that persons in supportive housing, compared to when they were homeless, they use homeless shelters less, they use hospitals and emergency rooms less, there's less incarceration or justice involvement. So these are the main categories here. So again, just as important as those quality of life, it's how are people also avoiding using these systems that are not easy for them to use, and they don't want to be involved, but that's sort of where they get pushed to. But it also benefits our systems and our communities. All right. As I said, please feel free to reach out and contact me anytime. But if we have any questions or discussion.